Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Ministry of Propaganda. And tonight we are going to be talking about the one-year anniversary of the escalation of hostilities in Ukraine. I guess you could say the start of the Russo-Ukrainian War, or something like that, depending on who you speak to. So, Chris, yes, 1 year on, what are your thoughts and feelings? What do you want to discuss tonight?
So, just to start off, first off, as you've just introduced it as, and as everybody in the media has been introducing as, they've all been calling it the 1 year anniversary. And of course, we have to match that as well, so people can actually find our video. But as we both know, this isn't 1 year. This is coming on 10 years. Originally, this started in 2014. And I've actually just been looking this morning how vigorously Ukraine's propagandists have managed to scrub the internet of all references to the Ukrainian Civil War, which, if you remember back in the day, this is what this was, and this is what this started was. I've actually just been checking right now, and even Wikipedia has managed to remove any article on civil uprising. Now, as far back as 2014, this is always now being referenced as the Russo-Ukrainian War, as this was always how it started, and this had nothing to do with any internal divisions within the country itself. I just thought it was quite an interesting point just to start on.
Absolutely, mate. Yeah, I agree with you. The 6-month review of the escalation of conflicts, if we want to call it that, the escalation of conflict, which we did 6 months ago, we said, truth is the first casualty of war, which might have been Isachillis or American senator called Hiram Warren Johnson, who might have been the first person to say that. But that's definitely the case here. And like you just said, the decision or the framing of this as the first anniversary is an attempt, very much so, to try and scrub the 8 years or 7 years of conflict that happened before February 24th, 2022. But I think, you have to sort of think about what Zelensky said at some point recently, where he said the war started in Crimea, and it must end in Crimea. So if that's according to Zelensky, then in fact, actually, according to his own standards, this conflict, whether you want to call that a war, this is now just sort of clutching at sort of splitting hairs over definitions. But I do think he's correct. It did start in Crimea and the Donbass, and that's not last year. That started at least 8 years ago.
In fact, what it is, it's splitting hairs in the definition of Ukrainians, effectively. People always say, we're helping the Ukrainian government because we need to save Ukrainians. But it's very much what qualifies as a Ukrainian, because those people who were born in Donbass are Ukrainians. They speak Russian primarily, but the way the media portrays them, they were never Ukrainians. They'll always write it Russian-backed separatists. You mean Ukrainians? These people separated from the state. So there's a lot of sort of mental gymnastics going on to try and justify why it's okay to have been killing these people.
Yes, absolutely. You're right. That's, obviously at the heart of it, right? The national sort of question of Ukraine in Putin's speech. That was a big thing about sort of talking about the relationship between Russians and Ukrainians historically. But yes, also Russian speakers and their position within this Ukraine. And and what it means to be Ukrainian. This is very much a civil war, a national war sort of defining the nation. I'm just going to play a quick clip here of what happened then back in of the 24th of Feb 2014. So also, I guess, an anniversary in that sense. Following the Maidan coup, where the elected government of Ukraine was overthrown, supported by the West, the infamous Victoria Nuland phone call, Senator McCain flying in, John Kerry flying in, and Biden doing his work too back then, leading to this overthrow of the government and a coup, and then the response, which, as you can see now in the video, this is what happened 8 years ago, with Crimea going first, and then an outbreak of basically, a rebellion from the Russian speakers of the country in the east, in Donbass. That's the prelude. We have to remember that happened. And in the meantime, this sort of the hottest part of this first outbreak, I guess, kind of peters off in 2016 or 2015, as you can see on the map here. But trenches were being dug, and shells and exchanges of fire were taking place throughout the 7 years. I mean, there are thousands of casualties: Ukrainian civilians in the Donbass, Ukrainian troops, as well as DPR troops, those republics that then were established. But yeah, you can see, just to give you perspective, this is basically what happened before 2022 and over the 8 years. So there you can see the sort of area of the country that the Civil War was fought, and then of course Crimea. But yeah, we've also then got if you want to recap what happened in the last few years, last year. So the last year of the conflict, Chris has got this video for us, and this is what it looks like. So we're not going to go through everything. We're not going to go for an attempt to talk about every single battle of the war, but here you go. This is the conflict as it broke out. Oh, hold on a second, Chris. I think you might want to go back there, mate. Let's go back. Sorry. This is the beginning here. Yeah. Okay, so here's the beginning. So this is 24th of February 2022. And over the next few minutes, you'll see then how the conflict unfolded. Yeah, okay.
So I think it was July when we last did our video, wasn't it?
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
So as we'll see, so originally there was that quite, as we described at the time, an overexertion of territory where they spilled into just outside of Kiev. Obviously, they rearranged themselves, reformed. Obviously, it's a massive land border to be trying to occupy. And I think I made the joke at the time that I'm not a tactician, but I do play a lot of Hearts of Iron. And I know you don't want the border that open.
Yeah.
To fight thousands of miles of combat. So repurposing it in the south and the east was definitely the smart move. And by the looks of it here, as we can see, we theorized this in our last video, but the border hasn't changed overly dramatically since our last video. In the past few weeks, months after that, we saw a few Ukrainian gains, and in the past few months, we've seen some more Russian counter gains. But for the most part, as we sort of suggested, the border as it is not likely to change. It's now turned into very much a war of attrition for both sides.
Yeah, definitely. I think we'll come back to this point about the initial invasion force and how many troops they had, and comparing it to other invasion forces over the years, or the 20th century particularly. I do think that big stretch, the drive to Kiev and driving around Chernihiv and all of that stuff they took in the north and the northeast was probably insufficient. I think history sort of, or the last year has proven that with the amount of support that the Ukrainians got from NATO, it was not enough. It's a big territory. It's a big country. I think it's safe to say that the borders after the Kherson the Ukrainians took back Kherson city and that sort of piece of Kherson province over the river, over the Dnieper River, and then the counteroffensive in Kharkov. Things have kind of stayed the same. The only sort of notable thing to say to this, though, is that the mobilization with Putin mobilizing 300,000 troops and those guys being trained and arriving, that's taking place now, actually. So everyone has been talking about the 1 year anniversary, the new invasion, the second wave, what do you want to call it? That is actually taking place. It's not actually taking place as many people thought it might. Obviously, we haven't seen this surge from the north or from Belarus like we did a year ago. It appears that they're doing it sort of in the Donbass, around Bakhmut, and breaking through there, but in a much slower, steadier way. Bear in mind, I'm going to sort of caveat that because a year ago, obviously, everyone was saying that this was never going to happen. We'd been hearing about a Russian invasion and preparation for troops for weeks and weeks and weeks. And I'm just going to play you a quick clip of myself and Jen back then with another co-host, Das James, laughing about the fact that the war was, this invasion was sort of in our faces, and we're going to, it was coming at any point, and we kept on talking about it for weeks and weeks and weeks. And here you go. Let me play this for you. 1 second. Why can't I? I think we've got too many pictures. Oh, there we go. Yeah. So here we go. There's a video of us laughing about this invasion that was never going to happen.
For about 3 weeks now, I think, or maybe even longer. About
it's been a subject of discussion ever since we began this program.
Right, exactly. So we started about, I think, the end of last year, and it hasn't stopped. It's always been there. Troops are coming to Ukraine. Troops are coming to the border of Russia, and build up. At least from the Western perspective, this was how it was portrayed, right? There's build up of Russian troops. There's a build up of Russian troops, and the penultimate moment was they're going to invade on the 16th of February at maybe 3 in the morning, which was, it's quite shocking that you would give a specific time to it. And it's now the 18th of February, and has Russia invaded Ukraine?
No, they have not.
No.
So there you go. That's us getting it wrong, I guess.
Not by far, though, to be honest. Well, it was 24th in the end, wasn't it? So
it's 24th in the end. So yeah, we got that wrong. But bear in mind, we're not the only ones that got that wrong. Zelensky wasn't sure either. So I mean, he wasn't. So
he was saying at the time, wasn't he? Saying, well, if the West have proof intelligence saying that Russia are going to invade, they haven't shared it with us.
Yeah,
which is hilarious to think that he was so in the dark that his friends and allies didn't tell him officially through any official channels that an attack was coming. They told the media.
Yeah, I mean, in all fairness, the West was saying and trying to convince everyone that this was going to happen.
But they didn't
so there was
relay any proof. Yeah.
So they didn't want to go. So this is the issue that and this will be interesting when we have the conversation about Nord Stream, about protecting sources. So the Western, particularly US intelligence agencies, were trying to say this is going to happen, but didn't want to give them the sources and tell them exactly how they knew, apart from satellite images and whatnot. But even the French and the Germans, there's some correspondence that I read in the Washington Post. They said basically, well, because of Iraq, because of 2003 and the false intelligence that was used to justify that war, the French and the Germans were very skeptical and said that, military intelligence is susceptible to political influence in America. So that's also why lots of people didn't actually think this was going to happen. And bear in mind, we did have lots of these moments where troops build up on a border. It was quite common, exercises and stuff.
And as we both know, with embassies, particularly American and Russian, but every other person at one of these embassies is a spy for the other side. This is like, it was only last week or the week before where a British security guard who worked at the embassy in Berlin has just been sent to prison for sending information to Russia. When they actually opened his locker, they found a picture in his locker of Putin putting Angela Merkel in a headlock while she's wearing a Nazi uniform. It's like, you had this in your locker. You are the worst spy.
I mean, he was definitely a spy from wish.com, right? So, yeah. Wait, I didn't know that. So he actually had a picture of Putin putting Angela Merkel in a headlock in his locker, working at the embassy in Berlin.
In the embassy in Berlin.
Yeah. I mean, it's just pretty low hanging fruit. No, not the best spy. Okay, all right. Yeah, but you're right though. Intelligence agencies using diplomats, it's common practice for intelligence stuff. So like we said, we're not going to be able to actually go through every part of this war. I mean, we already did that at the 6-month review. I think the 6-month review, we talked about the surge of troops from the north, the sinking of the Moskva, the propaganda war around Snake Island, the battle for Mariupol. We're not going to go through all of that again. I think we're going to cover the second half, actually, stuff that's happened in the last 6 months, and then maybe some other points that we want to go over. The first thing I would like to talk about actually then is body count. So how many people have been killed, how many soldiers have died, how many wounded. And this is arguably one of the most political parts of the war, in terms of, who says which number, and who says any number at all, and which side. So often Western sources will only give a statistic on Russian casualties. Sometimes they give a Ukrainian, but often they don't. And sort of the number of people, or number of casualties, basically, is a highly political number. So I've got a quick clip which I'll play, which did happen in the second half of the war, which is Ursula von der Leyen giving out the statistic, which she had to quickly say that it was not what she intended to say, despite having an army of script writers and all sorts of staff who have no doubt reviewed her speeches or her speech before she spoke. They still let her say this.
In statement.
Russia's invasion of Ukraine has brought death, devastation, and unspeakable suffering. We all remember the horrors of Bucha. It is estimated that more than 20,000 civilians and more than 100,000 Ukrainian military officers have been killed so far.
Okay, so just to clarify, we're not obviously celebrating about the death of anyone here. We're talking about a war. I wish this could be over tomorrow. But yes, she said 100,000 dead, and almost instantly had to say, nope, that's not what I meant to say. That's not. I was saying casualties. I was combining casualties with wounded with killed, and to some sort. She actually just repealed that. She didn't even give any.
She also probably meant military personnel instead of officers, because I dare say an army probably doesn't have 100,000 officers.
Right.
That's a hell of an officer class.
Yeah. So go ahead, Chris.
Yeah. So Ukraine have been quite famously tight-lipped about their casualty list. Probably at the time of our last review, they were sort of saying that they couldn't go on with the casualty rate. They were losing 100 men a day. Obviously, that is, when you sort of try and think of it in a war, it doesn't seem like a lot, but obviously 100 a day tallies up very quickly to a lot. And
yes,
you can't go on, but if you consider how long it actually takes to train people to use the equipment that's now being shipped in. I know at the beginning of the war, they were sort of using what they had, which you would have been trained with. Here's your rifle. You've got so many shots to train with. Once your clip's gone, you're fully trained. But now there's specialist weapon coming in, which is taking, realistically, logically thinking, it takes about a year to learn how to correctly use something like a leopard tank. I imagine corners are being cut, and a lot of it is, we're probably going to get into this a little bit later, but I think a lot of the training is sort of corners are being cut because they don't really expect this stuff to work for very long. The way this equipment is being sourced from different warehouses all over Germany, a lot of them, all over Europe, sorry, a lot of them haven't got parts that are interchangeable. So a lot of it will be a case where, well, if it breaks down, you're never going to be able to fix it. You're never going to be able to find a part to fix it, because one from another leopard tank isn't necessarily going to work on this one.
Yeah. On that point of tanks, that is one of the big concerns about the Leopard or Challenger or Abrams. Different caliber of round, 120. T tanks, Soviet era T tanks are 125. Parts. It's a different engine. It's different tracks. Different all sorts. Manuals are not necessarily written in Russian or Ukrainian. So repair manuals, all sorts of. There's different layers of things you have to consider there with sending kit, particularly technical kit. Like that too.
So like I said, with the special equipment going on now, you would expect that to sort of show some essentially dramatic change in your casualty rate. Ideally, from a Ukrainian point of view, you'd want to see a reduce in casualties, because now your weapons are longer range, they're more accurate, and you shouldn't be having to get as close to Russian front lines as they used to. But obviously, they are being so tight-lipped with what she's just sort of said is quite it feels like a proper oops moment that she probably got braces for afterwards, that this wasn't meant to be public knowledge. Ukraine don't want people knowing how many people they're losing.
Absolutely.
Same as Russia, and it completely makes sense for that information to not become public, because it's a massive blow to morale. When you lose a load of people, you've got two ways of playing it. Either build them into heroes of the war and use that to promote recruitment, but it doesn't always work, and it can easily, like, if you compare it to the way Russia lost so many troops in World War II, turning those casualties into heroes, which fueled more troops, comparing that to the losses of Americans in Vietnam, where you could lose equal amount of troops, and all that does is fuel the anti-war movement.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. No, this is why the statistic is so fought over and hidden. So yes, of course, the Russians misreport, I think, or underreport their casualties for the same reason that it's a political thing. It has weight. We're losing our sons, we're losing our children to conflict. Our people are being killed. It's definitely a political number. You mentioned the Vietnam War there too. So I've actually got some, just to give us sort of historical perspective of the last year of this conflict. What does it compare to in terms of losses, in terms of deployment to other wars from the 20th century? So first, I'll just give you the sort of tallies of different individuals that have given different numbers regarding this conflict. So the last year, 2022, sorry. So I've already said Ursula von der Leyen, the EU president, said 100,000 dead Ukrainian officers. So that's the number that she put out. Other sort of statistic I'll just put from the UN, 18 million civilians have been displaced. So a lot of people have been displaced by this conflict. Coming back to sort of military statistics. So you then also have the Norwegian chief of the army said that the Russian combined, so wounded and killed, is 180,000. Comparison to that then is the UK Ministry of Defense puts the Russian combined as 175 to 200,000. Russian KIA, according to the Ministry of Defense, the UK Ministry of Defense, is between 40 and 60,000 dead soldiers, Russian soldiers. That's, the UK MOD. Scott Ritter, who's an independent military analyst, a former UN inspector, I was listening to one of his streams the other day. He put his estimate of Russian dead at 45,000. So close to the Ministry of Defense, UK Ministry of Defence's estimate, actually. Victoria Nuland, the famous Victoria Nuland, she also put the Russian combined casualties, so that's wounded and dead, 200,000. And then General Mill Miley, the US Chief of Staff, so head of the US military, put Russian combined at over 100,000. So obviously Victoria Nuland, as you'd expect, is trying to make the number as big as possible. And General Miley a bit softer. So, I mean, from a, to give you sort of idea of the range there, Norwegian says 180K combined. MOD says between 175 to 200. Victoria says over 200. The chief of staff of the US says over 100. And then the only sort of group that I found so far that gives a statistic on Russian killed is Scott Ritter and the UK Ministry of Defense, which is between 40 and 60, and Scott saying 45. So that's give you a perspective of the casualties. Ukrainian casualties, as I said, Ursula says 100,000. She's not supposed to say that. The Ukrainian government themselves says 10 to 13,000 killed, which, if we're honest, is not a realistic number at all. Bear in mind that Peskov, the head of the Russian, the Putin spokesman, in September said that the Russian KIA was 5,937, which also not a realistic statistic. No. To give you Ukrainian wounded or combined, the Norwegian chief of the army said 100,000, and a British colonel who writes for the Telegraph put it at 120,000. So that gives you kind of some sort of perspective. Okay, so now to compare it, so let's just pick a statistic. Let's just focus on the Russian KIA statistics between 40 to 60. So let's call it 50, the middle, 50,000 KIA killed in action. Vietnam, all of Vietnam. So that's 10 years, 10 years of full deployment for the US. Just for the US, they had 58,000 killed. So that's 10 years. So just to give you an idea of the scale of fighting, we're seeing or have seen fighting that has been that has killed as many people, many soldiers as 10 years of Vietnam War did, for the US at least, for perspective. Korea also the same, for US between 54 and 33, depending on which source you look at. So bear in mind, a lot of this is statistics, is the way you measure it, the way you when you start, when you end, what you consider to be a casualty, obviously does vary. So it's not exact, but even Korea, the maximum, the highest number I could find for US killed in action is 54,000. So again, if we say 50,000 Russians have died in this conflict, it equals what the US lost in Korea, which was 3 years of conflict. So 1 year of this, 3 years of that, same number. And again, Vietnam, 10 years of Vietnam equals more or less 1 year of this. To give you more modern examples, 4.4 thousand US troops died in Iraq, in all of Iraq, 7 years of full deployment. Afghanistan, 20 years, only 2.4 thousand. So you're really seeing then scale of how vicious the fighting is. I do want to throw in a comment quick, Chris, on this one.
Yeah, I think it's quite sobering, really, to sort of hear that comparison. When this started, a lot of the media was almost naively so going to draw a comparison between this and the war in Georgia, which, of course, I don't think even had, look at these, didn't even reach 1,000 dead combined.
I haven't even included that in my comparison. Yeah,
it was a drop in the ocean compared to this.
Yeah.
What this is a real war of becoming a historical proportion. For the first 9 months of the escalation, it was consistently referred to as a special military operation. As of quite recently, you do hear more Putin interchangeably swapping his wording out for, he'll start the sentence with special military operation, but they end it with, we need to put an end to this war. And so you are seeing now the admission that this is what it is. Gone are the days of declaring war. It has just sleepwalked into this, and it is becoming a Vietnam, Afghanistan level conflict. Right.
I mean, just on that point of the legality. So, for example, the US never declared war on Vietnam. It was a part of various operations. They
never admitted war in Cambodia.
Yeah, right, exactly. That's it. They never even admitted it. So, it's quite common for war to happen without the legal declaration of war. Technically, actually, after 1945, it's quite ordinary for that to be the case. For perhaps
I think Hitler declared war on America, didn't he? But
who's that? Sorry.
After that, I can't think of anybody doing that, really.
Right. Yeah.
It's quite an old-fashioned sort of way of doing it. Surprise attacks are the way of the future now, aren't they?
Yeah. No. So I mean, technically, this thing of the SMO. Well, I mean, Operation Desert Storm was Operation Desert Storm. It wasn't we're declaring war on Iraq. It's the same thing also. Operation Rolling Thunder, Operation Linebacker, all of the stuff in Vietnam was a part of an operation.
Yeah, the Malayan emergency.
Exactly. Afghanistan
there is the political usage of why wars are called this.
Yeah. So in common speak, we would say war, but on the sort of paper, these things fall into either an operation or something like that commonly, apart from World War II and proper declarations of war. But I agree with you, though, that we're talking about something that in terms of, in terms of the US element in Vietnam, the Russians have already lost an equal amount of troops to what the US lost in all of Vietnam. You have to sort of then look at what the South Vietnamese and North Vietnamese lost to get an idea of actually what the comparison is. So the South Vietnamese lost between 250,000 across, the sort of 10-year period. And then the North Vietnamese, if you count, they count from 1955 to 1975, so a bit longer, but they lost 1.1 million. So if we're talking about comparison, then we're talking about something that is the Vietnam War, but from the perspective of the Vietnamese, not just the Americans. So this has already surpassed and will surpass what the Americans lost in Vietnam. Just if you're looking on one force, just to give you then perspective. So if we're going to compare conflicts, which is what we're trying to do, trying to place this conflict in an historical context and its size and proportion compared to other historical conflicts. World War I, so if you want to use a World War I reference, of course, this is not as big as World War I or World War II, but it's...
And hopefully we'll not get to that.
hopefully it doesn't get to there. No, this is just to give you a perspective. So World War I, 1916, Verdun, the Battle of Verdun, which was 9 months long, the longest battle of the war. The Germans lost 143,000 dead. So that's 3 times what the Russians have already lost. Over 9 months. So that's perspective. And then the Battle of Stalingrad, 750,000 dead over 5 months. So a lot more than this. So those are just battles, bear in mind. So those are just battles within those wars. So there would have been other battles going on, which would have been, maybe the same size or probably a bit smaller. Yeah. So again, we're not quite there. Like, it's not as big and dramatic as that, but it is certainly as big as some of the battles of the big battles of World War I and World War II. So that's casualties. Just to give you perspective, again, coming back to this whole thing of how many troops they deployed. So right now, according to the Ukrainians and New York Times, there's 320,000 Russian troops in Ukrainian territory, and with reserves of 150 to 250 behind that. So we'll just focus on the active element, the 320,000. In Vietnam, the peak for the US troops was 549,000, so not as many. So we're talking about 200,000 less than that, 220,000 less than that, 30,000 less than that. Korea, the peak deployment was 326,000. So it's about the same. So Russia has about the same amount of troops in Ukraine as the Americans had in Korea back in the 1950s, 1950 to 1953. NATO, all forces never went over 130,000 anytime in Afghanistan. And the USSR, to give a Russian comparison, the USSR had 115,000 troops at the peak of about 1986, 95. 150,000. So call it a third of what they have deployed to Ukraine, which is quite a big comparison. So this is much bigger than the war of Afghanistan for Russians, much bigger. And just, 2 more statistics I'll leave for this one. Iraq won Desert Storm. The US deployed 700,000 troops, so twice as much as they have in Ukraine now, which is quite strange if you think about it, considering that it was Iraq, which is a far less equipped, much smaller country than Ukraine. So the US deployed twice as much to fight.
For the most part, put down their weapons fairly quickly.
Yeah.
But the Republican Guard in Iraq didn't do a tremendous amount of the fighting. It was actually the insurgency that did the majority of the fighting afterwards, the Mujahideen.
Yes. Yeah.
Mainly Al-Qaeda and the other jihadi groups. The elite Republican Guard, as the famous sort of Bill Hicks joke used to go, after a few weeks of fighting, it turned from the elite Republican Guard to the Republican Guard to the Republicans made the shit up about there being guards out there.
I like that one. That's good. Yeah. But I mean, just for perspective again, the Russians have deployed less troops or have less troops right now in Ukraine than both of the Iraq wars. So Desert Storm as well as 2003, the US had double, and then 700K on the first one and 460,000 in 2003. So 100,000 more than what the Russians have deployed, at least in Ukraine. So still much smaller than some of the battles of World War I. We had 500,000 or 1 million people, and Barbarossa 3.8 million. So I just wanted to do this to give you some perspective and to sober us in terms of where we sit historically, comparing this to other conflicts. Obviously, every conflict is different. People make references to World War I or World War II or the Spanish Civil War. Every conflict is actually different. We're talking about a nuclear-armed Russia, not Iraq. Not talking about Vietnam, civil war in Vietnam. But in terms of troop deployments, at the moment, it's about the same as what the US put into Korea, and the Russians have lost, it seems, as many troops as the Americans lost in Vietnam, in 10 years in Vietnam. It's a pretty heavy, big war. We're not talking about a small thing here. This is a big war. And if you look at those numbers, it doesn't feel like it's going to go away anytime soon. I don't feel like it's going to wrap up quickly. I hope it will. I hope I'm wrong. But those are big numbers.
Yeah. No, unfortunately, I don't. It is one of the points of something to discuss in this episode of how does this end, and there doesn't seem to be an obvious ending. Both sides politically are in a very tenuous position. Zelensky and his government are he doesn't have a firm grip of power. And there are so many nationalist groups in Ukraine that even if he was to do the smart thing and say, I'm going to negotiate with Russia, if there was any hint that those negotiations meant Ukraine giving up territory, I have every belief that he'd be removed. There would literally be another nationalist coup in Ukraine, and it would have an even more hardline group that would say, no, we're fighting Russia until the end. There are groups in Ukraine, and as we warned in the last episode, everyone now is so well armed. If the central government in Ukraine did collapse, it would end up like the end of Afghanistan, that you'd have 1,000 warlords armed to the teeth, all fighting in the same territory for their version of Ukraine. And you'd have all the pogroms you can imagine, dead Russians in the street, anyone who's speaking Russian languages, dead Jews.
Yeah.
It would be absolute chaos. So,
yeah. And
I think that is something that obviously the Russians must realize as well, that they want the Ukrainian government, they need an opposition there that they can negotiate with. If Kiev falls, then there's nobody to talk to. They still need that central power there.
Right. Yeah. No, there is so many different ways with the angles of where this could go. There's bad angles if it goes against Russia and Russia falls back and has to collapse or something like that. There's a lot of bad angles where that goes, and who knows where that goes. We shouldn't want to try and explore that. But also on the other side, from the Ukrainian end, if they collapse too, like you said, you've got piles and piles of arms, all sorts of groups with all sorts of ideas and all sorts of adventurists and mercenaries, and all of that still would unravel. And even, when this broke out, people had already started, as you said, pogroms. I mean, they were tying Roma people up to lampposts. Back in 2014-16, you had the burning of the trade union hall in Odessa. Stuff like that happened even when, a much smaller level of chaos was taking place in Ukraine. So God knows what would happen if...
and it was always against Russian-speaking Ukrainians, leftists, and they didn't care. Like some of the victims in the trade union building in Odessa back in 2014 were children who was... And on Ukrainian TV, they applauded when they said, "Oh, these were Russian foreigners." They literally applauded on national TV that they burned 100 people to death in a building. Yeah. So it's scary how bad things can go. And as you sort of said there, with the Russian side, the Americans constantly have been putting their fan fiction to the media, pretending that there's going to be a palace coup in the Kremlin, as if everyone who's surrounding Putin is just dreaming of fields of flowers and peace. And it's like, you think that somebody that you like even less could topple Putin. Like, why do they automatically assume if Putin is removed, the person who gets in is suddenly going to be willing to negotiate with America?
Right. Exactly. Yeah. I mean, the devil, right? So
yeah.
Yeah. No, absolutely. Yeah.
So just as you sort of alluded to there, now I think this should be right time to get into it. So this week, there's been a story that has broken. I'm not going to say what news channel it is because if someone clocks on, we'll get demonetized and removed. They'll see it anyway. Not demonetized, we're not monetized anyway, but our video will get banned from YouTube if it is, because the news channel is banned. But a story of an American, former American soldier who joined the Ukrainian army and has defected to Russia. And the story goes, this was always his intention. This man says that he is a communist, he's an anti-fascist, and his intention the whole time was to basically plant himself as a spy right in the middle of the Ukrainian government and to hand that information to... So I've got a few videos. It was quite a long interview, so I've just pulled out some of the more interesting aspects of this. I just wanted to sort of share this and see what we think. So here's the first one here.
All right. There
US Army soldier John McIntyre was a foreign mercenary in Ukraine.
Down there, it's me and all the boys. Say what's up, y'all.
Earlier this month, he defected to Russia. He brought everything with him: papers, files, intelligence, and maps. The thing is, he always meant to.
The first question is, why are you here? I mean...
Well, it's the reason I came to Ukraine in the first place. You know, I'm a communist, I'm an anti-fascist, and we have to fight fascism everywhere, you know. So when I came to Ukraine, I knew that I would try to get as much information as I could about, you know, anything that would be helpful and defect across lines. The problem is when I was in Kharkov, I was going to swim across, and I found out they had snipers in position. So if anybody, and actually found out that the snipers were for defectors, not for actually protection. They were actually, anybody who tried to defect, they would shoot them, you know.
Since March 2022, John served in Ukraine's Foreign Legion and Nationalist Battalion Karpatskaya Sech. He saw and documented the Ukrainian war machine in all its ugly glory from the inside. He became part of it.
God bless Ukraine, God bless America, but you, Russia.
You, Russia. It's Russian.
To Russia. Can I step on this?
Slava Ukraini.
Heroям слава.
It's Russia.
Russia. As time went on, you know, I had to become more nationalistic, more Nazistic, you know, doing...
Does that explain the videos where you were Putin and...
Yeah, of course. It's part of it to maintain my cover, because I got to become them. You know what I mean? If I'm going to be with them, I got to become them, you know, and doing the, you know, Hitler salute, stepping on Russian flags, everything. Oh, yeah. Karpatska siege, baby. Slava Ukraina. Heroям слава. Slava, slava, slava. Yeah. When I first came, I kind of expected they wouldn't be that big of a problem. Like, I kind of, you know, assumed that it was just like a, I didn't think there was actually that many. But when I came, I was really surprised. It was everybody have, you know, tattoos and Nazi symbolism. Sometime later on my Facebook page, I had pictures of Che Guevara and the Soviet Union, and I got questioned for having communist views, and I had to think quick on my feet, you know, and I just told him, I said, hey, I'm an anti-fascist. I'm here to fight Russian imperialism and the Nazis and this and that. And they said, no, the Russians aren't the Nazis, we're the Nazis.
So yeah, quite a lot to sort of unpack there. That was just like an introduction just into him. I've got a few more clips from the interview to sort of pull out. What do you think?
I mean, I also, I'd seen it before. I didn't see the whole thing. I think I saw most of what you've just shown there. But I mean, a part of me, obviously, you know, there's a part that thinks, it reminds me of that scene from Saving Private Ryan, when they captured the German soldier, and he's like, oh, fuck Hitler. Oh, yeah. So, I mean, where you want to say maybe he's just saying this because, you know, he's on a sinking ship. I don't know, maybe he was in Bakhmut and he needed to get the hell out of there. And so he's said whatever he needs to say to get out of it. But I mean, regardless of whether that's true or not, he has shared the side.
Well, that's it. It's not the fact that he's saying it. It's what he's provided. That he's arrived with stuff that he's stolen. He shouldn't have left with this stuff. So it's not like, we've just found some dickhead in the woods. It's like, I was a defector. I'm here to help. He's left I mean, with that intention to hand this information over.
Yeah, he's handed over information. So I guess in that functionary sense, he's performed that function. He, I mean, again, this is an awkward one for Western media. This is something that they can't report on because he's there showing them with the black sun. He's then showing them with the Totenkopf, what it's called, the skull, the SS skull, the literal SS symbol, along with, talking about Hitler salutes, talking about the fact that they're happy to be called Nazis and happy to be associated with Nazis. yeah,
I heard actually
again,
a Ukrainian defender, the worst defense of the SS skull, that it wasn't originally Nazi, it was Prussian.
oh, I see.
Oh, right,
Yeah.
the peaceful Prussian people, yes.
Yeah. Yes,
That's
peaceful
okay then.
Yeah. So, again, we've discussed this before. This element of the Ukrainian military does exist. I mean, as I said before, it's not every Ukrainian soldier. It's not every Ukrainian, of course not. But the fact that they openly allow battalions, regiments, units with this kind of iconography and those kinds of soldiers, they are allowing neo-Nazi and actual fascists to serve in the army and fight.
Turn a blind eye to it, because you have to remember when the Nazis got in. I know it is almost a lazy comparison to compare every conflict to Nazis and communists, but when the Nazis did get into Germany, not everyone in Germany was a Nazi. The Nazis were still a minority party when they got in. They got in because enough people turned a blind eye to it. And as long as enough people say they won't be that bad when they're in power, that's what happens. And the fact that Zelensky and his predecessors have said, oh, we need people like the right sector because they're good fighters. I've heard leftists say to me, like, you got to admire their fighting spirit, though, haven't you? Of the Azov battalion. So they are literally Nazis. Like, do you have to admire their fighting spirit? The SS had fighting spirit. You don't have to admire it.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So yes, this guy has made it awkward again. He's an American citizen. He's an American soldier, ex soldier. So the fact that he's got that side, that training. I mean, in that video, so he also made some awkward stuff about the fact that there's cocaine and prostitutes and drugs on US bases and stuff. But yeah, minor point. Let's not go into that. Yeah. So very awkward. Again, this is something that won't be covered, won't be discussed, and sort of kind of brushed aside awkwardly by mainstream media, particularly Western media. I mean, there's so much, again, to unpack we're talking about here. The other thing I wanted to mention was about, we talked about just numbers of weapons. I don't know if I mentioned this earlier, but in the first 6 days of the conflict, this is a statistic that's come out a bit later, is there was 17,000 missiles sent to Ukraine in the first 6 days after Feb 24, 2022. So that's your Javelins, your Stingers and whatnot. So there are just these weapons. I mean, the amount of support that NATO, particularly the US, has given to Ukraine is insane. It's huge. I mean, we gave the statistics 6 months ago. You know, they gave the entire defense budget equivalent of Russia to the Ukrainians, you know, in aid, and probably will exceed it. I think you had a clip earlier, or a picture actually, Chris. I'll share it now for us here of a Javelin up for sale.
So photo has come. This screenshot, has come from. I don't know if any of our viewers know anything about like Tor browsers and the black markets that you can find on there, where basically unlisted weapon markets, drug markets. This is from one of these. So this is it's quite poor resolution. Can we zoom in on that? Does it let you zoom in on?
We can. It's not quite zoomable. But okay, we'll give you a perspective.
Yeah, so it's from the thief market. This is a Javelin missile that we've given to Ukrainians that the Ukrainians have stuck online for peanuts compared to its true value. But of course, for them, it's all markup, isn't it? They didn't pay for it.
Exactly.
There was a video or article not so long ago of an American general getting quite irate with the Ukrainians because the Ukrainians aren't giving precise feedback to where these weapons and money is going. And for a lot of American generals, it feels like they're just throwing money in a well. And that they want a bit of bureaucracy behind it. They want receipts and paper trails of show me what you're doing with the weaponry. And the Ukrainians just aren't offering it up. And I have just got another video that I want to show here from that interview that just goes into that quite well, because it backs up that accusation quite well. Sorry, it's not that.
Not that. Okay.
This one.
And there's the corruption. Always the corruption in Ukraine. Western taxpayers, says John, are being robbed left and right.
And then they take the insurance money and then they put the insurance money in their pockets.
Oh,
Yeah.
is this what they do
Yeah, they take in the insurance money too.
for foreign fighters?
Yeah. Yeah.
And was this a common practice?
Yeah, of course. I mean, like most, like I'd say 90% of the families, they don't get their insurance money from, and they take in salaries too. You know, like if a soldier terminates contract, like I did with the Carpathian Siege, I terminated contract. Yeah.
Right.
They take in the last paycheck, they take in this money for themselves. But this doesn't go back into the unit. It just goes straight to the commander's pocket. And it's not just with the insurance. It's with I mean, there's a huge black market going on with the Javelin rockets, the M4 rifles, and M240 Bravo machine guns, and all the weaponry coming in. They take in all these and they sell it.
You've seen this?
Yeah. Yeah, they stole, like, when I was in the Legion, they took like 20 Javelin rockets. They took like 60 M4s and like 20 M240s.
Who took them?
The, like the logistics sergeant major and then the battalion commander, they were both in on it and stuff. They're actually...
In Carpathian Siege or?
The Legion.
Yeah,
in the Legion.
Were they Ukrainians?
Yeah, they were Ukrainians, yeah.
So it just validates that post that you just shared, that was originally shared about 6 months ago. Of course, this interview was from last week. So he's saying the same thing. We know he was there, and now he's confirming that these markets are coming from these weapons that we're providing Ukraine.
Yeah, I mean, what he just said there also just reminds me of, well, it actually smells and sounds very much the same as many of the other Western-backed operations. So the South Vietnamese army had the same thing: corruption, ghost soldiers, stuff being put on sale. The Afghan army, as we all know, was mostly on paper. You know, people paying salaries to things that didn't exist, just putting them in their pockets. Weapons going willy-nilly all over the place, sold to whoever they wanted to, really. Yeah, this is the same flavor, the similar flavor of Western-backed regime, government, puppet, I don't know what you want to call it. Yeah, and stuff going missing, and salaries being paid and salaries being stolen. I'm pretty sad.
That comparison is fantastic because the composition of the Ukrainian army is so similar in that respect that there are so many political paramilitaries and political militias that have been incorporated into the army. And you've got to think, well, what level of incorporation? By incorporate, do you mean that you've sent them a letter saying you are now officially part of the Ukrainian army? And then there's not really much sort of paperwork and bureaucracy or checks and balances that go with that.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, and also, yeah, this is the speed and escalation and sort of scale and how big this war and how quickly it got that big and how much money was pumped in. It is just, you can expect there's going to be so much more loss, so much loss. Yeah, this is not an orderly escalation. I mean, not that escalations usually are, but this was like, you know, super chaotic. Yeah, I mean, the other thing I wanted to cover with this then is I don't know if we want to talk about sort of the military side. I think we've covered quite a lot of the military side of things. Chris, I don't know if you go any further into this or not, any other stuff, particularly about fighting and sort of troops and stuff like that?
In terms of the actual fighting, I think we've sort of covered quite a lot. Obviously, we don't want to really go into battle by battle because there's more than we could do in a day. And it sort of dates everything because it's the fighting's ongoing. It's going to be out of date by the time people watch the video. So I'm not sure how much good it can go.
I guess the closing point on that is that most of the fighting right now will take place, it seems, in around Donbass, particularly around Bakhmut. Maybe we'll see a counteroffensive at some point by the Ukrainians later this year. We'll see. But at the moment, the Russian escalation, the mobilization is focused around Bakhmut and Donbass. So we'll see where that goes. I agree with you. Yeah, we're not going to try and make any grand, assessments and descriptions right now. It's too big, and there's too much to cover for the whole war. So you can watch maybe our last video or other videos on the specifics of that. And I think the map's done a good job of that. But in terms of economics, so the other side of this war has been the economic side, right? So we saw grain disruption, fuel disruption, gas prices going up, energy prices going up, all sorts of stuff. Oh, sorry, just one final point actually regarding fighting before I go into the economics. According to Business Insider, so Ukraine says Russia faced its deadliest day in the war yet, with over 1,000 troops killed in a 24-hour period. So all of we've just said, all of that we've just discussed regarding how big this war is, it is actually getting more intense. The fighting is actually increasing. The casualties are going up. So this is only going to get worse as far as the trajectory is going now. So yeah, final point on the fighting. So come back to the economics. The sanctions. So I'm just going to show you here from the Washington Post a question that they posed. Did the sanctions work? What's the stock take on that? How effective were they? So without reading the entire article, at a sort of glance, no, they failed. The Russian economy only shrank by 2.1%. Okay, so projections were, 10, 15, 20%, but Putin made an announcement in recently, that basically only 2.1% reduction, which is not at all what the West was hoping to get. These sanctions were supposed to cripple the Russians. Also, other calculations put it at 2.5%. Comparatively, the Ukrainian economy has shrunk by 33%, which is a massive shrink. Yeah. So, any thoughts on the sanctions, Chris, while we're looking at this?
So obviously they have completely backfired. I think we all know. I've been watching a few bloggers who've been going around sanction hit Russia, looking at all the businesses that dramatically announced that they've left, such as McDonald's and your Costas. And you just got to think that the agreement that these companies had with Russia in the first place was that they operated there, 10% of the money goes back to the United States and the rest stays in Russia. But it seems that they've left officially. The building's still there, the staff's still there, the stock is still there. All that has happened is that 10% doesn't go back to America anymore. You can still go to McDonald's in Russia. It's not called McDonald's anymore, but it is McDonald's. It's just got a different logo.
Right.
It seems so short-sighted, and everything was sort of done for political dramatic effect. And of course, we've been paying in the UK out of our noses for gas. There's a trend in Russia that's going on recently on VK, which is their Facebook alternative, of Russians leaving their hobs on. Just videos of them burning gas because they're paying dollars a month of it. Just to show how I can heat my entire apartment up with just my burners. And the same thing is going on in the DNR, in Donetsk.
Mm-hmm.
They're paying next to nothing for gas. So it's like, well, what are these sanctions actually doing if the only people that have been affected by them are the people that have applied them?
Yeah, good point. Just to put in the sort of macro statistics here, this is from a man called Gérard Dipipo. Apparently, he's an important person to listen to, but he shows the statistics here of the US dollar billions of Russia's current account balance. So, as you can see, 2013, 2014, all up and down. At the outbreak or escalation of conflict, you can see that the reserves, US dollar billions, goes up. So, and the share of GDP goes up. So, yeah, basically their economy, because they managed to sell gas to others, and because the prices of things like oil and gas were changed, they benefited from this to the point where, they managed to dodge the worst effects of the sanctions. So 2.5 or 2.1% shrinkage. I think just on the devil's in the detail, though, I do think that those sanctions will have a long-term effect. So we've talked about chips before. So chips, complex microchips for weapon systems and computers and stuff. That's not something that can just be turned on overnight, and an industry that can just emerge overnight. It's not like steel. It's not like crops. It's very complex stuff that there is a limited amount of knowledge and people that know how to make it, and companies that know how to make it, and that will affect them in the long term. Although, having said that, this was said 6 months ago that because there's no, the supply of complex microchips to Russia has been severed because of the sanctions, that they'll run out of missiles, cruise missiles and whatnot, next week, next month, imminently. They've been saying that for 6 months. So, and they haven't. There's still wave after wave of strikes taking place across targets across Ukraine. So that hasn't happened.
Well, this is just to sort of jump back into military sort of side of it as well. Again, this is sort of a negative effect of the West's approach to similar to what they did with COVID, the economy that the West have built up of just enough, just in time, where we don't stockpile anything, where the Russians do. So when they're saying, oh, the Russians are going to run out of rockets that have microchips in them, so they've got 70 years worth of old Soviet artillery that doesn't have any microchips in it. They'll start throwing kitchen sinks at you if they need to. This is why the reports have come out that they're going to be using deliveries of North Korean weapons, which you can almost guarantee doesn't have a microchip in either. So it's very much that it's a problem that the West have developed in their head that Russia can quite easily circumnavigate. You can guarantee that the West are going to run out of microchipped weapons before Russia run out of the old pull string artillery shells.
That's actually a good point. Yes, yeah. Actually, that is something that, to dip back in the military stuff, has already been discussed. The British Army, for example, has, from many sources, even Western sources, have been saying that if this happened anywhere in Western Europe, France or Germany or whatever, and Britain tried to help, or even on British soil, God forbid, they would not be able to sustain this kind of conflict for a week, definitely not a month. Yes, so I agree with your statement there that the Russians have lots of shells and lots of materials, and have outlasted all of the estimates given so far regarding shells or missiles or tanks even. Just to dip back into you already mentioned McDonald's. So I've got a clip here of the replacement. So these companies that left, clothing companies, Starbucks, McDonald's, have been replaced by Russian equivalents. So I'm going to show you, first I'm going to show you the McDonald's. So this is the McDonald's now in Russia. This is what it looks like.
So Russia now has its own version of McDonald's. It comes under a different name here. It's called Russo-Ukrainian War, which essentially means tasty, and that's it. Also has a different label or a different logo. You can see it right there. It's supposed to symbolize, the company says, fries and a hamburger. Other than that, a lot of things are actually very similar to McDonald's. However, there is no Big Mac, and there also is no Happy Meal either. As you can see, this place is pretty much jam-packed. There's really a lot of people who came here. We spoke to some of the customers, including some actually wearing the symbols of Vladimir Putin's war in Ukraine, which of course the Russians call a special military operation.
Food and politics have nothing in common. Like, come on, man, keep things separate. Basically, it's important for me to have that McDonald's feel.
I think it's not a good idea because McDonald's, it's a history, it's a brand, it's a great idea. It's not classical McDonald's.
As you can see, the Russian version of McDonald's looks a lot like McDonald's. You have the double cheeseburger here, fries, and this is a 9-piece, not McNuggets, it's nuggets, and some sort of soft drink. See how it tastes. So the packaging is also very...
Let's skip ahead. So just to give perspective, of course, McDonald's was, even the Soviet Union had McDonald's. So we've reached the point where...
It did. So they hate the Russian Federation more than they hated the Soviet Union.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah.
You just said that the knowledge for microchips is finite, but the knowledge for Big Macs is not. I mean, they've literally done nothing by pulling it out.
Right. So it's quite funny, that one. There's also, I'll show you the next one, which is some of the drinks, and of course what's happened to Starbucks. The drinks are quite entertaining. I think the creativity is coming out. Hold on, so here we go. I'll turn the music off. But yeah, so there we go. It's called Stars Coffee. So only a few letters have been removed, really, and still has the woman sort of symbol. It's the same, pretty much. The other stuff they've been making is, of course, here's the McDonald's again, which has been replaced by Tasty. I forgot what the Russian name was. But drinks, so soft drinks, have also been replaced. So Coca-Cola and Pepsi, as you can see. Here we have Funky Monkey Cola and Loco Cola is some of the replacements. And then just
Loco Cola was the name of, back in communist Romania, there was a musical called Coca-Cola, where it was a cowboy who went to a bar in Romania, and he plays a song called Coca-Cola to introduce Coca-Cola soft drinks to communist Romania. That's where they've got that name from.
Oh, brilliant trivia. Well done. 10 points. That's brilliant. So let's see what else they've got. So some statistics here. Let's jump ahead. So we've also then got Fanta. There's back to Stars Coffee. Let me show you the Fanta. So they've got a nice replacement for Fanta called
Cool Cola.
Fancy. We've got Cool Cola. Yeah. Here we go. This is the replacement. It's called Frussel. Any communist reference for that one?
No. It feels weird that they're depriving Fanta. Fanta was Nazi Coke anyway, wasn't it?
Yeah, it's true, actually. Yes. I mean, they've obviously shipped that to the Ukrainians. Fantola. This is Fantola, which is also got a bit of a panda, a unicorn. Nice. And what's the last one we've got here? Fantola got into a bit of trouble. They said they were being original. And the last one here is a sort of another variant of Coke called Cola. If you can't read Cyrillic, that says Cola, with a bird on it and stuff. So yeah. There you go. That's what's happened to some of the brands, after these sanctions. So in a way, I think this is, a look at what a world that was globalized and then deglobalized, at least in some places, what that looks like.
Yeah.
When you try and replace globalized brands with local stuff.
Like national capitalism.
I think it's going to last. Hey.
When you try and turn international capitalism back into national capitalism.
Yes. Yeah. I don't know if you can turn back the wheels of globalization. I think that it's quite a force to push.
Yes,
back.
it is.
We're through the war. We're seeing at least a glimmer of what that might look like if you try and, go back to national capitalism, I suppose. Yeah. Anyway, but that's the sanctions, and that's what's happening. I think then we should talk about the peace plan. Chris, what do you think?
Yes. So we've got here a clip of the. No, that's not the right one. A clip of the foreign minister sort of announcing it.
Chinese foreign minister.
Yeah. So obviously, our podcast listeners won't be able to sort of see what's going on. But so obviously, there's not a tremendous amount to sort of unpack here. So basically, they're announcing the 12 points, I believe this is.
Yeah, 12 points.
Yeah, and to be honest, it's had quite a surprising reaction internationally. What do you think about how it's been received?
To be honest, actually, so I haven't looked so much into how it's been received. I've read the points, and I actually, well, I think sort of a bit of I wouldn't say conspiracy theory on my part, but I do think that it's interesting. So I'm going to put up the actual document here, what it says. But I do think it's interesting that we've had in the last week, after this peace plan was revealed, the FBI and Ministry of Energy releasing their opinions on, or their official assessments, I should say, on where COVID came from, the COVID lab leak theory. And they both said that they believe it was a Chinese lab leak. The COVID was a lab leak.
To be fair to the FBI, which is the sentence the same version, they said that this lab leak theory is a theory that they hold with a low optimism.
Yes, low confidence.
What was the point of even saying it then? Say, well, we don't really believe it, but we are saying it.
Did the FBI? I know the Department of Energy, because of course the Department of Energy is the first person we go to when we think about pandemics. They all said low confidence. Their internal intelligence agency said they had low confidence on this.
They had low confidence in their own theory.
Right. So I just thought that was quite interesting because it came after the release of this, and in this document, so in the 12 points, you have the Chinese mention that they oppose the development of any chemical, biological weapons. So, I don't feel like the people at the FBI are stupid enough to realize the implications of them releasing their opinion, saying that the Chinese released or accidentally released COVID, and how that relates to the official big Chinese opinion now on this 12th point here, which mentions biological weapons. So I don't know. I don't think that would have been lost on them. I don't think that's something that's an accident. I think that's certainly something they calculated. But sorry, this is just my aside. My only thought that I had so far regarding this and its reaction. So I've only had a look at the actual points, and I've thought more about what the Chinese points are addressing. So point number 1, respect the sovereignty of all countries. Okay, I think this point is very much as the UN General Assembly has voted that the respecting the sovereignty of all countries is very important. It's a fundamental element of the United Nations Charter. So yes. I think that they're realizing that, of course, that needs to be said. And
I think this is something that China are very consistent of. They've always respected the sovereignty of other countries, which is why they're so vigorously defending people who are using a comparison, saying, well, isn't what is happening in Ukraine similar to what you want to do with Taiwan? Which, of course, their response would be, well, no, because Taiwan is a breakaway province
it's
of China.
as a part
by their own admission. They are the Republic of China.
Yes. Yeah, and also everyone represents one China. Well, not everyone, almost everyone, apart from Eswatini.
Yeah. So it is a false comparison that Western media are making when they are trying to do this. So I think this is a good point for them to have put in as number 1.
Yeah, you can see the structure of this is very intentional, as you would expect from the Chinese Foreign Ministry. Yeah, so that point there is of course actually there's a mention or sort of an aside to the Taiwan question. So respect the sovereignty of countries. Don't involve yourself in the internal affairs of other countries. And then the second point, of course, is very much taking the Russian perspective of this conflict, right? So indeed, they are saying, don't invade other countries, of course. We can understand that. We can respect that. Of course, that is a violation. But then they're straight away saying, hold on. Yeah, we should abandon the Cold War mentality. That's the second point, which if you read into it, then you can see talking about bloc mentality. So, so the security of a region should not be achieved by strengthening or expanding military blocs. So this is very much straight into NATO should not be growing and encroaching into any region in a way that compromises or threatens other countries. The legitimate security interests and concerns of all countries must be taken seriously and addressed properly. Okay, so there's no simple solution to a complex issue. So this is very much, I think, saying that it's all well and good respecting the sovereignty of all countries. We must do that, of course, but we also can't let military blocs grow and ignore that effect that it has on the legitimate security concerns of countries that are in the sights of those military blocs. So exactly. You can see the balance there. You can see the balance being struck there.
Fair assessment to put in there. Anyone with any sort of a real political sort of understanding knows what NATO is, knows that it has always been a no Russia club. Proven by the fact that Stalin requested to join, Putin requested to join twice, I believe, and they said no, because it was almost just to prove the point that, as I think one of the original founders of NATO pointed out, NATO's job is to keep the Germans down and the Russians out.
And the Americans in. Yeah.
And the Americans in.
Yeah. That's right. Yeah. No, I think we've covered that before, and I think our listeners know this too. That is the nature of NATO. NATO has proven itself to be is as such.
Yes.
Yeah. Third points. So I'll just read the points. So point 1 we've covered. Point 2 we've covered. Point 3 is ceasing hostilities. So ending the war. 4 is resuming peace talks. 5, resolving the humanitarian crisis. 6, protecting civilians and prisoners of war. 7, keeping nuclear power plants safe. 8, reducing strategic risks.
So 7, just to quickly
go ahead.
Put on that. Obviously, that's one of the allegations that the West keep making of Russia, which when you stop to think about it for more than 2 minutes is ridiculous. That the accusation that Russia have been occupying a nuclear plant and then shelling it.
Yes.
It seems when you say it out loud, it's like Chernobyl was in their control when the media were accusing them of bombing it.
Yeah,
that is
no, I mean
stupid.
Zaporizhia, right? So this is basically about Zaporizhia. I mean, there might be other power plants that I'm not familiar with.
Yeah.
The situation you just described is Zaporizhia, where the Russians hold it, and the Ukrainians have been trying to take it back and shelling in order to, try and advance right next to the power station. So yes, like the Russians wouldn't shell their own power station. They're in control of it. They have it in their hands. It's in their possession. Why would they shell it? Anyway, it is ridiculous. Just on point 8, so reducing strategic risks, which is very similar to point 7 actually. This is where China opposes the research, development, use of chemical and biological weapons by any country under any circumstances. So this is what I was talking about earlier about the restatement by the FBI and the Department of Energy from the US releasing that they have with low confidence think that COVID was a lab leak. I do feel like that is they would have known that there's a contradiction. They're contradicting at least some statement here by the Chinese, or at least the Chinese position. But yeah, again, it's just an aside. Number 9, facilitating grain exports. Number 10, stopping unilateral sanctions. And 11, keeping industrial supply chains stable. Final point, promoting post-conflict reconstruction. On this one here, stopping unilateral sanctions. So this is, again, very much aimed at the US and collective West, if you want to use that term. Long-arm jurisdiction. Okay, so telling other countries how they can trade because of your policy. So denying other nations the independence of their own economic actions and choices. So if you are, Mali or Burkina Faso, putting sanctions in place which tell you that if you trade with Russia or trade with a Russian company, whether that be with grain or, I think grain doesn't apply in this case, but sanctions are pretty wide. I think fertilizer was actually applied at some point, sanctions on that. Bottom line being that you're telling those countries what to do. So,
and obviously this is something that China have been, again, consistent of. They have never voted to sanction a country. They've always abstained from sanctions. And it's something that they've firmly believed in, that sanctions are not a useful tool for promoting behaviors amongst countries.
Yeah, absolutely. It is, in some form of imperialism, a form of unilateralism, that you are dictating how people and the economy, the global economy, how it will be run and how it will be pursued, and how individual nations can pursue their own economic aims and goals.
So I think it's interesting, the reaction that this peace plan, the media, the Western media particularly, jumped on it before there'd been a look at it, saying, "Oh, this is just pro-Russian peace plan just to appease Russia." Where the actual reaction from leaders, Zelensky likes it for all intents and purposes. He says that he wants to believe that China is on the side of peace, and he's requested a meeting with Xi Jinping. So it does seem that, despite America hoping Zelensky would just repeat what they said, that this is, it seems like he is willing to give it a chance. And I hope that is true, because it's not nothing. China don't write fluff documents for the sake of releasing something. They didn't need to do anything. They didn't need to release a peace plan. And now they are the only superpower actually releasing a peace plan, because America aren't.
Well, I think that's the very clever placement that China has achieved here. I mean, I think they genuinely want peace. I don't think that they've done this as a chess move. I think they genuinely want the war to end. Many countries do, and do recognize the Ukrainian side to this as well, the sovereignty element, which they've put as their first point. But they have positioned themselves as people, the side that wants peace, which now, again, it's awkward for Western nations to say, oh, do you agree with the peace plan, or the idea of this peace plan, or some form of peace plan? And the West, effectively, those guys you see, those spokespeople that stand at the front, answer questions from the press, will have to say, no, we don't think it's a legitimate peace plan. They'll have to sort of spin something which justifies why they don't agree with the peace. So they then are anti-peace at that point.
It goes on to that Cold War mentality that this is a proxy war. There's a joke in Russia that's going around currently that America will fight to the very last Ukrainian life.
Oh yeah.
And that seems to be as it is. That the Americans don't want their own people to die, but they do want. They'll throw as many foreigners as they need to at Russia.
Yeah,
because that's what this is about.
Yeah, definitely. And you just said proxy war there, which actually a point I wanted to make earlier is you can almost see this as a proxy war within a proxy war. So you have, of course, Ukraine, which is the proxy war for Russia to fight the West, particularly the US, effectively the US. But now if you have China on the other side and you have all these threats from the US saying, don't give Russians lethal aid, you better not. And that effectively means that we have the potential. I mean, China might change its position, who knows, and start supporting the Russians, which then effectively means that the Russians become a proxy for China to fight the US with. So it would be almost a layering of proxy war, a second layer of
well, I think we've been saying this consistently for the past sort of year, that everything that is going on this conflict is one of the preludes to the inevitable conflict between America and China.
Yeah. I mean, I think the only element to that discussion is that we've always thought about it as Taiwan will be next, and this is the prelude to that. But actually, perhaps we could argue that Russia could be the proxy between China and Russia. Sorry, China and the US. And sort of if this escalated in a particular direction, which I don't want it to, which I don't think it should, but of course it has the potential to. If the Chinese feel that actually Russia breaking up is something they cannot stand, then they choose to hold them up and support them and arm them and supply them. That would be how that could happen quite easily if the escalation continues going up and up and up. There's something you've said. I've come blank. Give me a moment. But any thoughts?
No, not really. I feel like we might have sort of covered quite a bit, really, there, haven't we?
Yeah, no, I think we have. So our next episode will be, I believe, on Nord Stream. So we've discussed a lot over the last sort of hour and 20 minutes, and a lot has happened in the last 6 months and over the year, of course. We didn't mention the Nord Stream pipeline, which actually, on my part at least, was intentional because it needs to be examined specifically because of how much weight it carries from this war particularly, but also just geopolitically, and also some of the characters that have written about and spoken about it. So there's Noam Chomsky, Seymour Hersh, Jeffrey Sachs, the Chinese government. There's a lot of people that have said and demanded some sort of inquiry and discussion about this. So we will be doing at least our small little part and looking at that for at least an hour next week. So you have that to look forward to. And of course, if you were listening and thinking, well, why haven't you discussed Nord Stream? It's because we're going to talk about it for an hour. That's why. So thank you very much, everyone. And thank you, Chris. And we'll catch you to discuss Nord Stream 2 soon. Yeah. Cheers, Chris. Bye-bye, everyone.
Goodbye.